Montoya, the Juan Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and my program today is The Christian in Me. This has been a series of comments by the Reverend Bruce Clare. First one was The Humanist in Me, which I did again. The last one was The Theist in Me, which I did a couple months ago. This one is The Christian in Me. So starts off just naming his sermons that he's did. That he was, says, perhaps you could suggest more titles that seem appropriate. I could speak of the Judaism, for I have been deeply influenced by that tradition. Though I make no pretense at being a scientist, I could easily claim to speak about the scientist. I have some sympathetic understanding for those who are looking for our roots in more primitive, earth-centered religions. And to that extent, I could also be a pagan. To go on and on, and perhaps over time I will add to the current list that's already here. But today I propose to have the Christian in me. Even though we may not call ourselves individually Christian, our denomination has grown from the Christian tradition. Further, such celebrations as Christmas Day are an important part of our culture, and no matter how secularized and commercialized it has become, or may become, there is no denying that this holiday season focuses on the man for Christianity was established, Jesus. Christianity is the religion of Jesus, and it is appropriate to take a deeper look at the influence of that person, that religion, lives. This is as true for Unitarian Universalists as it is for Roy Phillips' story about the cross in the closet at the Unitarian Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, is a very common story, both symbolically and literally, for Unitarian churches around the country. Sometime during the last 50 years or so, the vast majority of our Unitarian churches in this country removed the cross from prominent display in their sanctuary. In this sanctuary, we have a Catholic, because we were establishing some churches. One urban church I know offers this typical example. The cross was there in the front until about 20 years ago. Its removal was only mildly controversial. But most people in the church believed that Unitarianism had grown beyond its Christian roots, and that the cross was no longer central to their religion. A few strongly objected, but their opposition to removing the cross had more to do with the importance of tradition than it did with theology. It was removed from the main sanctuary and placed in a small chapel in another wing of the church. Over the years, the chapel was used less and less, until eventually it became a storage place, like a large closet. Today, in the main sanctuary, where the cross used to be, there hangs a large, beautiful tapestry of Tree of Life. This has become the visual focus for the congregation. But all souls, our covenant, is the visual focus in our sanctuary. And many people, especially new members, comment on how meaningful it is. Once in a while, though, I hear a comment about how wonderful the covenant is. I hear it described as being where the cross is supposed to be. In New England, where some of the oldest church buildings are Unitarian, it is fairly easy to identify them. Instead of the cross on the top of these steeples, there's usually a weather. What goes around comes around, they say. Today, a number of Unitarians are reconsidering our almost universal decision over the last century to remove crosses from positions of prominence in Unitarian churches. One of the earliest criticisms came in an article about 15 years ago by Duke Gray, then minister of the First Unitarian Church of Chicago. Duke entitled his article, "Is Dracula a Unitarian?" He pointed out an interesting coincidence. In the 1600s, Unitarianism flourished in a section of Europe known as Pennsylvania. And of course, Transylvania is also known as the legendary home of the vampire Dracula. The legend of Dracula, he reminded us, includes this curious fact. Dracula was frightened of crosses. In the presence of a cross, Dracula would lose his power, cringe in fear, and run away. Duke suggested that Unitarians today, like Dracula, suffer from an ailment he has called cross cringe. we are afraid of them, he said, and when around the feelings range from mild discomfort to rigid antagonism. I see both. There is enough truth in what Duke said that most of us recognize what he means when he talks about cross cringe. I think the truth is far more complicated than that. What I'd like to do this morning is symbolically bring the cross out of the closet, dust it off, and look at it again. When I am done, we may wish to put it back there, in there, and that's all right with me too. My plea is that it not be summarily started, that we know where it is in case we. I also want to talk about the context of my own life and my own religious views. I was born into a solidly liberal Christian home, raised in a conservatively Christian church, and socialized in a predominantly Christian culture. I suspect that much of this is true for many people. You and I still live in a predominantly Christian culture. It is impossible for me, it's impossible for me to deny that there is a lot of Christian in me, though sometimes I may foolishly try to deny it. Whatever Christian there is in me, I have found it upon honest reflection to be an important and comforting source of strength. And for that, I am grateful to that Christian home, that Christian church, and that Christian culture. To identify the Christian in me, I find it easiest to begin with a look at the Unitarian relationship to Christianity. It has been a long journey for Unitarianism from the Reformation days to today. 400 years ago, all Unitarians considered themselves to be Christian. More than that, they considered themselves, as every Christian group considers itself, to be the most genuine Christian. Of course, the rest of Christendom had a difficult time recognizing that. Many Unitarians today find it awkward to understand how our forebears could reject the doctrine of the Trinity and still consider themselves Christians. This only attests to how miserable Unitarians have been in the act and art of theological persuasion from the start. Of course, theological persuasion in those days often took the shape of the sword. The early Unitarians were thoroughly biblical in their convictions. I'll explain this position briefly. I won't dwell on it. The distinction between a Unitarian Christian and a Trinitarian Christian has perhaps been explained by the distinction Unitarians often make between the religion of Jesus, the religion that Jesus taught, and the religion about Jesus, the religion that centers on who Jesus was. To the extent that there is a Christian, it is decidedly the religion that Jesus taught, rather than the religion of Jesus. There are really two radically different religions in the New Testament. Remember what your grandmother called the red letter Bible? Those were Bibles specially printed so that the words of Jesus appear in red print, and everything else appears in black. Believe it or not, your grandmother was quoting a Unitarian Bible. Because if you examine only the words of Jesus, that is, the teachings of Jesus, you will find nothing remotely resembling the Trinitarian formula, which asks us to worship him as if he were a god. Nothing. All such talk came from those who lived after Jesus. The religion that Jesus taught was primarily ethical. How to live rightly, how to treat others. When Jesus was asked, "Teacher, what shall we do to inherit life?" he did not answer with a creed to be believed. He answered by saying, "Just love God and just love neighbor as yourself. That is all you are required to do." And he then illustrated that love by telling a parable of the Good Samaritan, which you will recall is a story about ethics, not about God. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is mentioned about some creedal statement concerning the nature of the Godhead. The religion that Jesus taught was thoroughly ethical, not theological. If you wish to know the religion of Jesus, don't dwell upon the edicts and proclamations of churches of the ages. Look at the red letter words. Take, for example, the Sermon on the Mount. Here, Jesus offers ethical advice. So, whatever you wish others to do so to them. This has been received through the ages as the golden rule. Seek reconciliation with those you are in conflict with. In fact, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. He offers advice on moral humility. Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but do not see the log that is in your own eye? First, take the log out of your own eye, then you will clearly see the speck out of your brother's. Take the speck out of your brother's eye. He offers comfort to those who are troubled. Blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who, for they shall be comforted. He advises spiritual humility, telling people not to pray in public, like the hypocrites, but practice your piety, prayer, spirituality, private. And he offers hope and aspiration. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine so that others may see your good works. This is the religion that Jesus taught. If it be Christianity, then it's a Christian religion. The religion that Jesus taught has to do with loving your enemies, caring for the needy, putting people above wealth, power, accepting those who are different, showing mercy, seeking justice, things like that. Or as Jesus himself put it, I have come to preach good news to the poor, proclaim peace to the captives, recovering the sight of the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Elsewhere, he said, I've come that you may have life, have it more abundantly. That is the religion of Jesus, and it is one that I share, one that is shared by most Unitarian Universalists. Christian in me and you ain't strong to the extent that we take those teachings seriously. Unfortunately, much was to happen to Christianity that was to shape it, or at least a large part of it, into something that other than what Jesus taught. After Jesus died, others came along and taught a different religion about who Jesus was. The focus of this new religion shifted attention away from the teachings of Jesus to a belief about the divine nature of Jesus. The earliest and most prominent opponent of this new religion was Paul the Apostle, the author of most of the New Testament. But you don't find many red letters in the books he wrote, because he did not teach the religion that Jesus taught. He taught a new religion that centered on the doctrine that Jesus was some form of God. The distinction between these two religions is significant. In one, Jesus is human. The other is God. The crucial practical difference, for me at least, is one of accessibility. If he is human, even I can aspire to follow teachings based on. If he is God, his life is no longer a model for my own, no longer accessible. Or how can I aspire to be like God? Some people are perplexed that Unitarian Universalists observe the Christmas holiday, wondering why we would do so if we don't worship God, the God, Jesus. To me, the key is found in that issue of accessibility, that Jesus was like me. The Christmas story is the birth of a child, the most humble of surroundings, being raised in the most ordinary of families, but arising to the heights of moral and spiritual accomplishment. To me, the story loses its power if, in fact, the ordinariness of a person, Jesus, is left out of the plot. Christmas is a universal metaphor that only gains in its power if it is the story of a real person. In describing the Christian in me, I have spoken so far mostly of the teacher Jesus. Let me say just a word about the religion that arose out of his teachings. Christianity. It is no secret that Christianity has had a rather checkered history. On one hand, there is the legacy of persecution, violence, and oppression. It has been used to justify evils ranging from slavery to suppression of women's rights. On the other hand, Christianity has been the inspiration for great feats of generosity and benevolence. Hospitals and schools, children's homes and charity organizations have been formed in our society, mostly out of Christian motivation. In most cities, there are probably more Christian welfare organizations that provide help to the needy than any other kind of agency. No one can deny that Christianity has given comfort and hope to countless souls over the centuries, and surely this must count as significant. In an 1821 sermon, William Ellery Channing spoke of how Christianity support to the great masses of people, even though they don't fully understand their own faith. It has had, he said, an exalting, consoling influence, power to confer happiness of future, to give that peace which the world cannot give. This faith of thousands who never read and cannot understand the learned books of Christian apologists, who want words to explain the ground of their belief, but who hold the gospel with conviction, more intimate and unwavering than mere argument ever produced. I mention this aspect of Christianity simply to honor the fact that it has, over the generations, offered profound hope, courage, and comfort to many. Hope, courage, and comfort are essential to any religion, and to the extent that my own religion contains them, I recognize Christianity as a major source for these values in me. But I'll return once more to history. Over the following centuries, Unitarians held firmly to their belief in Christianity as it was taught by Jesus. But something happened to Christendom over which they had no control. It became increasingly obvious that Paul's view of Christianity, that defined Jesus as the object of worship, had become widely accepted as the norm. The religion that Jesus taught had become secondary. I return to Channing. Over 150 years ago, Channing knew that Christianity was coming defined differently from the intent of its founder. In a sermon on Christianity, he wrote the following: "When I think what Christianity has become in the hands of politicians and priests, how it has crushed our soul for ages, how it has struck the intellect with palsy and haunted the imagination with superstitious phantoms, when I think how under almost every form of this religion, its ministers have hewn and compressed it into the shape of rigid creeds, and have then pursued by menaces of everlasting woe whoever should question the divinity of these words of their hands, these works of their hands. When I consider in a word how under such influence Christianity has been used, still is exhibited forms which shock alike the reason, conscience, and heart. I feel deeply, painfully, what a different system it is from that which Jesus taught. I make no bones about it, no apologies for it. Unitarians lost the battle over what defines Christianity. It took them a long time to realize they lost. As recently as 100 years ago, most Unitarians still held tenaciously to the view that theirs was an authentically Christian religion. It was too painful to let go of that view. So, in the last century, many Unitarians have let go, and the cross, for the most part, has been placed in the closet for safekeeping. Letting go wasn't easy. In the 1880s, the debate centered on a statement of covenant Unitarians, whether we should recognize that we follow the lordship of Jesus or the leadership of Jesus. Leadership won out. Later, the phrase became the spirit of Jesus. Today, our denominational covenant does not even mention Jesus. Instead, it recognizes the contributions of Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. The religion that Jesus taught is still very much part of this. But the religion that is taught about who Jesus was, which today seems to be to own the name Christianity, has little to do with who we are. I tell the story of the Unitarian journey with Christianity because it is sometimes parallel to my own story, and to the story of many Unitarians today. What the Unitarians experienced over 400 years of history was a grand-scale metaphor for what I experienced as an individual when coming into adulthood. While running from adolescence into adulthood, I tripped over a paradox. It was there, right in front of me, but I couldn't avoid bumping into it. What churches say Christianity is not what Jesus said, but it is the churches, not Jesus, that have the final say. So at some point in my life, and I cannot isolate it to a specific day or even a specific year, but at some point I realized that I had to contend myself with not being Christian. I had to let go of belief, even if much of Christianity remained in me. And so the symbolic cross was stored away in some symbolic closet. And it is too bad, really. I have never lost respect for what Jesus taught. Of all the things he said, there are only a few with which I disagree. And there are a few that I don't understand, but the vast majority of his teachings I find to be profound, inspiring, true. But since the churches seem to define a Christian differently, most of us have forsaken the label, closeted the symbol of the cross. My reason for going through this history this morning is to suggest that Unitarians, while they may have closeted the symbol and the label to a large extent, have not, in my view, forsaken the religion that Jesus taught. At least I don't feel I have. I have said that most of us have forsaken the label Christian. I am quick to point out that there is a significant movement in our denomination known as the Unitarian Universalist Christian Fellowship. This group of Unitarians proudly and gladly claims the label Christian. I suppose I am proud and glad that they do, for they refuse to let others define it for them. In many of their Unitarian churches, the cross is still prominently displayed. I once spoke in a New Church in Rhode Island. It has a large cross dominating the sanctuary. They respond and they repeat the Lord's Prayer, which they call the Prayer of Jesus. I said earlier this morning that I want to bring the cross symbolically out of the closet, dust it off, and look at it again. It is important to do this from time to time, I think, as Unitarians, myself included, too often succumb to a very unhealthy trap. A key cornerstone of our outlook is tolerance. One cannot understand our principles without knowing how important it is for us to practice tolerance of other religions. We learn this mostly by being a minority religion ourselves. Too often, I'm afraid, our tolerance has a blind spot. And that blind spot is Christianity, especially Christianity that demands loyalty to Jesus more than loyalty to what Jesus taught. By identifying this blind spot in our tolerance, I am talking about myself as much as anyone else, because I often catch myself in this trap. As a group, we will find publicly criticizing Buddhism. No, sir. By talking Buddhism, it is to praise it, not bury it. Not everything I say about Judaism is sympathetic and understanding. I like nothing more than to strike up a conversation with an American Indian who can tell me about his native religion. I'm all ears and completely open. Even a Scientologist, a Mormon, or Hare Krishna can elicit a tolerant response from me. Why is it then that tolerance comes so much harder for us? And the subject is Christian religion. David Rankin, a Unitarian minister in Detroit, tells of the time he spoke at a Unitarian church in Philadelphia. He chose Christian symbolism and literature as his topic. After the service, he was asked to extend a sermon discussion in the basement. He was greeted by an angry man who shouted, "We have a free pulpit in this church, and we don't want any of that Christian garbage." Like W.C. Fields wrote Rankin, "I have never returned to Philadelphia." Why is it that tolerance seems so much harder for us when it comes to Christian religions? I think I know why. Those of you who have been, as I have said, a parent of a teenager, know that what the books say about adolescence is often true. Those of you who are going to be a parent of a teenager read those books cautiously. The books say this, among other things. The teenager is going to rebel. The teenager will ignore anything you say and have little tolerance for abuse. This is actually healthy, the books have referred to, because the adolescent is shaping his or her identity separate his or her parents. If all goes right, after the teenage years, when the adolescent has secure self-identity, then he or she will be able to relate to maturity again with the parent on equal terms. They may disagree, but they won't be quite as disagreeable, or say the books. Well, as Jesus might say in a parable, Unitarianism is like unto a teenager. Christianity is our parent. It is birth. After a very long childhood, we are now on our long teenage stage of rebellion, creating a separate identity which is healthy. I suppose, like any other teenager learning separation, we have very little patience for our parent. I suspect that may be why we find it easier to be more tolerant for Rastafarians than for Baptists. This analogy could, of course, be taken far too literally, but the lesson is sound. It takes a certain maturity to be tolerant. It takes a certain security in one's identity to risk being tolerant. Part of being tolerant with regard to Christianity is recognizing and honoring Christian parents. I have taken the cross out of our closet today in part to remind myself, but to remind you that our religious parent does indeed have something of value. And I hope that by taking it out once in a while, we can find it easier to understand and appreciate its value and not feel threatened. We will probably not make the cross central again, especially as long as Christianity remains a religion about Jesus more than a religion of Jesus. Nor would I want the cross central if that meant restricting or narrowing our religious search of vision. But neither should we altogether remove the cross and the tradition it represents. We should take it out once in a while, dust it off, honor it. Like the cross at the Unitarian Church in St. Paul, move it around. Now you see it, now you don't. Thank you.